Welcome back to The Real Story with Jeannie Ives. This podcast is here to connect the dots for voters on federal, state, and local policy. We bring you the real deal. We bring you the real facts and real people to discuss the topics of the day. Today with me in studio, I have retired Colonel Roman Golash. He served in the Medical Service Corps. He is Ukrainian by descent. In fact, he told me that his parents had to escape Ukraine just to save their lives. Roman was actually born in Germany. But he has spent most of his life growing up in America. He
Correct.
came here when he was 6 months old.
Right.
So Roman has been in constant contact with relatives that are still in Western Ukraine. And in addition to his time in the Army as a Medical Service Corps officer, he also was a military interpreter and spent 8 missions over...
8 missions during 6 years in the 90s.
Okay, so Roman, let's get started really there. Why don't you start out with very briefly explaining your parents' flight from Ukraine and why they had to escape.
Well, both of my parents were in the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, which was formed in 1942. And my mom was in the Red Cross. My dad was a combat commander. And they primarily located in the Carpathian Mountains. And they fought both the Germans and the Russians till about 1948. And then Mom, with her 2 girlfriends, went through Poland to Germany. My dad, with his company, went south through Slovakia to Germany. So they met up again in Germany and got married. I was born there. 6 months later, I was in the wonderful United States.
Well, that is just amazing. And so having to flee that and then, the Iron Curtain's there
Right.
permanently doesn't really fall apart until 1991
Right.
with the collapse of the Soviet Union at that point. And, 2 years earlier, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, which really
Right.
ignited all
Exactly.
of the other. So you then get to go back 2 years later in 93 for your first sort of mission in Ukraine, wearing the U.S. uniform.
Exactly.
And so what did you find when you went there? What were the people like? What was happening to them after having splintered from the Soviet Union?
Well, in 93, when we were forming the missions, the Pentagon contacted everyone in the Department of Defense who passed the Ukrainian test. And there were about 100 of us, Ukrainian Americans, who served. And we went on that first mission, and it was quite different because I spoke the language, but the Ukrainians looked upon us as if we came from a different world. They were so proud that they were Americans speaking Ukrainian, but they always used to tell us that they can spot an American a mile away. And I asked them, well, how can you do that? And they said, well, you Americans look up. You walk straight. We were beaten down for so long that we got used to looking down. So I said they were so glad to see us. People would just run to us and ask us questions and thank the United States for coming to Ukraine.
So is it really that much different having the eastern edge of Ukraine being heavily of Russian descent or a Russian ancestry, and having the rest of Ukraine being more, I would say, of pure Ukrainian descent? I mean, is that a problem, or are those Russians there? Which, I mean, they like to make the argument now that those Russians welcome Russian interference in the Free State of Ukraine. Is that true?
Well, not really.
Okay.
Ukraine is a very diverse nation.
And religiously diverse as
and
well.
religiously diverse.
Okay.
There's about 10-15% who are Catholic, Eastern Catholic, and then the rest are Ukrainian Orthodox. Mm-hmm. So there's a very important distinction for the Orthodox. So they're Ukrainian Orthodox, not Russian Orthodox. Russian Orthodox existed under the Soviet Union. They were essentially KGB agents. Ukrainian Orthodox priests were persecuted. The Catholic priests were killed left and right and were even sent to Siberia. So essentially we even had a cardinal, Yosef Slipy, who wouldn't give in to the Russians, and they sent him to Siberia. And then they brought him back. He came to Rome, and they made him a cardinal. And he was an amazing man who served time, but yet kept this faith with Jesus Christ.
So the Ukrainians have been at odds with the Soviets and then the Russians for a while.
Well, for hundreds of years.
Hundreds of years, that's right.
So
we're sort of myopic here. We just think the world started when the U.S. started, right?
Right.
And not understanding all the long legacy of Russia.
Well, exactly. I think United States, you can say, is more of a linear pattern, historical development, versus in Ukraine, it's a multi-plane and things going in different directions all the time. The thing to remember about Ukraine is that Ukrainian is a independent language, different from Russian, different from Polish, different from the other Slavic languages. And what they don't understand is that Ukrainians have always wanted freedom. That's primarily what they have. In 1918...
Doesn't everybody want freedom?
You would think so.
Okay.
But people sometimes kind of let themselves get sucked into something and then bad things happen. But in 1918, Ukraine declared independence, which a lot of people don't know.
No, I didn't know that.
And then in 1919, Lenin told Ukraine, you can be independent, but you don't need your army. So the Ukrainians naively dispersed their army. So then they sent down Russian troops, and the only people to protect the capital, like now, were 300 students. And they all marched towards the Russians. They all got massacred. And they now compare those 300, Krute, this is the town they were in, to the 300 Spartans. And then during the 20s and 30s, there was persecution. Then the war came, and the Russians then had a understanding with the Germans, but then the Germans attacked. Ended up, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army was formed in 1941, and then they ended up fighting both of them. Because the Russians were killing Ukrainians, the Germans came, and they started killing Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians said, the heck with that, let's just fight them all.
So we say that, and that actually puts context to what we see today.
Right.
So the Russians come in, and all of us receive some sort of tactical training. I was a transportation officer. I went to West Point, so we get our share of military history. We go through tactical training. We all understand how to do an operations order.
Right.
We have fundamental basic military training. And I think most people felt like the Russian army, all powerful, would just roll over Ukraine. And in the end, we're on, I think, day 13 as we record this podcast. And they have not defeated the Ukrainians at all.
No.
And perhaps it's this historical context that you give us that is the reason that there has been such a vicious fight among the Ukrainian people against the Russian invasion.
Well, you're exactly right. And don't forget that the people fighting for Ukraine now actually never experienced the Soviet Union. Because this happened in 1993. What happens now, when I talk to my relatives in Ukraine, is that they said the Ukrainian military is unbelievably motivated. And they've captured quite a few Russian soldiers. And the Russian soldiers didn't even know they were in Ukraine. They thought they were on maneuvers in Belarus. And they're not motivated. There were stories that they...
So the Russian soldiers, you are telling me, actually didn't know that they were going to be an invasion force for Ukraine, but rather they thought they were on simply a military exercise in Belarus.
Right. And then the other thing is...
How come we haven't heard that?
Well, it's interesting, Jeannie. We have to ask our press, why are they saying some things, but they're leaving other things, the truth, out? So the other thing I found out from my family relatives is that when the Russians die, they don't send the bodies back to Russia. They have crematoriums that follow their convoys. So as the Russians die, they cremate them.
So your relatives, you just spoke with them yesterday, you said.
Right.
They are in the western part of Ukraine. What is the status of them in terms of food supplies, fuel, heat, transportation, any sort of normalcy whatsoever, school going on, anything?
So far, it appears to be semi-normal. The unnormality is, for example, my family member, all the men are gone. And our relatives there, her name is Olya, and her husband Ivan is in the military, and so they took him from western Ukraine. He's near Kyiv, near the capital, protecting the capital. So another family members of ours, the mom has 2 sons there. Both sons are also mobilized. So there, in Western Ukraine so far, there hasn't been much activity except Putin is sending ballistic missiles from Belarus into Western Ukraine. And he's trying to hit civilian populations. He's trying to terrorize people in the West. He's not there yet, but I think he's trying to soften them up. So they're preparing for some eventuality of some war being taken all the way to the western regions of Ukraine.
Well, okay, so what do you think? What's your prediction here? Because I was on a radio program last night, and by far the prediction is that eventually Ukraine falls to the Russian aggression, and that it becomes one of two things: either Putin needs to settle, and he needs to come to the table and negotiate this, because he is suffering losses.
Right.
He's suffering loss of respect from his own countrymen. Right. They're not happy with him. Right. If we can further destroy his economy, there's quite a possibility that he has to come to the table, because he wasn't able to end this. He started something he thought, I think, he would be over in 24 hours.
He did,
but
yeah.
but it didn't happen that way for him. So there's a couple different scenarios that could play out.
Well,
he could go scorched earth.
He could,
which means that if you have a long, protracted action where they're basically taking over the government and then trying to eventually take over all parts of Ukraine, correct, you're going to have a scorched earth civil war on your hands. Not even civil war. The occupation forces will continue to be nipped at by the civilians. That's a prediction, much as they faced in Afghanistan, the Russians. Or you could have Putin come to the table, and there could be a negotiation. And some of that negotiation could be, well, why don't we just give them the Crimea? I mean, what's your prediction about what happens here over the next few weeks?
There's several scenarios that can happen here. First of all, Putin is irrational.
Yes.
He underestimated what he was going to receive in Ukraine. Second of all, we're being rather irrational here because we stopped the Keystone Pipeline. We stopped energy development. President Trump said we have to be energy independent. Currently, the administration feels you can't drill because we have to satisfy the Greens. So we're importing about 675,000 barrels of oil from Russia. All that money we give Russia is used to kill Ukrainians, because the economy of Russia is based on energy, oil production, selling it, and then using that money. Now, what happens is that if you stop the...
So just be precise here, though. The U.S. government itself is not purchasing the oil.
Right.
It floods onto the open market.
Right.
It's a commodity, and it is purchased just lots of oil from other companies that actually then take that crude oil and refine it and then sell it out for various products that we use in our economy. So there's an element here where we would have to say to our American corporations, you cannot purchase any Russian oil.
Right.
It doesn't mean to define that as a commodity, though. You basically have to shut them off. You want to shut them off entirely from the market.
Right, and that's exactly right. And that's
because they're going to get that price by selling it to others.
They may. But
I agree with you. I mean, we should definitely shut down
the thing is that it's pretty much the saying is, you can pay me now, you can pay me later. So the scenario is such that if we don't stop his economy and stop his military, and so the economy, we talked about stopping the oil and the SWIFT, Visa, MasterCard, payment systems, all that. That's one side on there. On the military side, which you and I are more involved in, is that Ukraine has been asking for weapon systems. Ukraine was attacked by Putin in 2014. Just do a little bit of retrospective. Ukraine asked for weapons from then Obama and Biden, and they wouldn't give them any weapons. They just sent blankets. That was a horrendous decision on the part of Obama. But they were pro-Putin, so they didn't give it to him. Ukraine
What,
was...
Joe Biden was pro-Putin? Wow, shocker.
So, and the reason it happened the way it did in 2014 is back in 1994, going back to my missions to Ukraine,
Yes.
is that President Clinton convinced Ukraine to give up their nukes. Ukraine was a nuclear power, and heavy weapons. And in return, President Clinton promised that the borders would be intact, and he guarantees the sovereignty of Ukraine. The Ukrainians believed him.
Was that written down in a treaty?
Yes, it was called the Budapest Memorandum. It is out there, and it was signed
approved by the Senate?
I'm not sure. It was the Russia, Ukraine, France, and England, I think, signed it. So Ukraine did give up their nukes and heavy weapons. And from 1994, then 2014, Putin annexed Crimea and the two eastern provinces.
Yes.
And at that point, Ukraine, I don't think, was too well prepared. And so they took those things and they stopped. But from 2014, they got a wake-up call. So they were preparing some as much as they could. And now you're fast forward to 2022, and you see that the preparations paid off.
Well, there's a common thread here, and it's Mr. Putin, who's
Yes.
been in power for 2 decades and has been, involved in KGB
Right.
operations
Exactly.
and Soviet intelligence for even past that. So he is the common thread. He's watched all this. What is his motive, truthfully? What do Ukrainians think his motive is? Because let me just set this
Yeah.
up for you. Is it truly an offensive action on his part? Or is it a defensive maneuver to protect his legacy?
Well, it depends if you look through Putin's prism of reality.
What do Ukrainians think?
Well,
what do you hear?
Ukrainians know that Putin wants to reestablish the Soviet Union, period.
That's what they know.
And Putin...
Well, we're going to go with what they know, but go ahead.
And Putin believes, like the previous Soviet leaders, that without Ukraine, there is no Soviet Union.
Aha.
That's their dogma. The other countries are kind of, well, okay, but if we don't have
what
Ukraine...
about Kazakhstan and
well,
Estonia?
you know,
and
not as much.
these
I
others?
mean,
Okay.
there's two elements to this. One, Ukraine is very rich in wheat growing. They have a lot of minerals there. And the other thing is this constant battle between the Russians, and they called Ukrainians the Malorusse, the little Russians, the little brothers. So they were always considered like second-class citizens. And for centuries, they felt that if we're going to make these Malorusse Russians, we have to destroy the language. And they almost did it in the 19th century. But then about 1840, a Ukrainian poet called Taras Shevchenko emerged. And he wrote poems about independence, about the Ukrainian language. And the Ukrainian language reawakened. And the Ukrainian patriotism was reawakened to the point that in 1964, Jeannie, in Washington, D.C., the Ukrainians put up a monument to Taras Shevchenko. And the keynote speaker was President Eisenhower.
My goodness. Well, that's a good bit of history. So Zelensky, let's
Yes.
talk about him. Quite the personality.
Yes.
Quite the leader in a time of crisis. And sometimes actually you don't know how well a person will act as a leader. You don't know their full ability as a leader until they put into a crisis situation. I think everybody kind of understood that Winston Churchill was a leader from the get-go.
Correct.
Right? But there's other people that until they're put in a situation you really don't understand. I mean, prior to this crisis, to some degree, a lot of suspicion about him. He's a man who's cracked down on his own press. He's a man who has cracked down on his own opponents. And so now he's coming to the forefront as being really that wartime leader, like nobody would believe that he would have been. And there's probably, Putin may have thought that he would have looked for safe passage out of the country and just let the Russians had it, almost like the Afghanistan president did in the wake of the Taliban coming in and taking the capital of Kabul. He just left with a few $1 million and his family and fled. Now, Zelensky didn't do that. He
Right.
stood up in the face of Soviet aggression or Russian aggression. So what is with this guy? Can you explain him at all?
Yes. Well, in the West, when they elected him, we were all kind of surprised.
Okay.
He came out of nowhere.
Okay.
He defeated Poroshenko. Poroshenko was a Ukrainian oligarch. Not that he was bad, but the Ukrainians got ticked off because he didn't move fast enough to join the European Union. And so somehow Zelensky came on board, and he was an actor. He had his own show pretending to be president, and he got elected. So we're scratching our heads here in the West thinking, we don't know what this guy's going to really do or not do. I think Putin thought that he is weak, that he can be manipulated, just like Yanukovych, predecessor to Poroshenko, and he could then control Ukraine. And it just turned the opposite. So now you have a war between Ukraine and Russia. The Ukrainian president is in the capital. Putin is not in Moscow.
Where's Putin?
He's back in the Urals.
Oh.
So
Hid out in the mountains.
He's in the mountains.
Kind of
So
like Hitler did at the
they
end of
said
the
he's
war.
not even in the capital because they say he's afraid for his life. So we shall see how it goes. But I think throughout history, in military history, etc., I mean, you do have people emerging at times of crisis. They step up to it. And Zelensky has been a surprise, pleasant surprise to everyone.
That's terrific. Well, we're going to pause there. And when we come back to the program, stay with us, please. We have a young Ukrainian who is a brand new U.S. citizen. His mother and his sister are still in Western Ukraine. We're going to get him on the line, and we're going to have a conversation with Yuri. So stay tuned.